Good afternoon. My name is Marissa DeAngelis, and I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us at this afternoon's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this afternoon's program, I would like to remind you to turn off any cell phones and other devices that make any noise, please. Our speaker tonight, John R. Bohrer, is a reporter, historian, and television news producer. As a producer during the 2016 presidential election, questions he created were put into nearly every major presidential candidate, which resulted into negotiable exchanges with future President Donald Trump and his opponent Hillary Clinton. Mr. Bohrer attended Washington State College in Chestertown, Maryland, and his work has been cited by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, as well as New York Magazine, The New Republic, Politico, and USA Today. Joe Scarborough of Morning Joe on MSNBC says, "For anyone inspired by the passion and courage revealed in RFK's final years, Jack Bohrer brilliantly captures Kennedy's evolution, from political hatchetman to becoming the compassionate hero who still inspires the world a half-century later." Tonight, Mr. Bohrer joins us to discuss his new book titled The Revolution of Robert Kennedy, From Power to Protest After JFK. He will explain how Robert Kennedy developed into a historical leader and why his message continues to resonate today. Following Mr. Bohrer's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. Please use the microphones when that time comes. And his book will also be up for sale and available for book signing after the speaker discusses what he's going to say. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Bohrer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. Thanks to Neil, thanks to Ann, thanks to Lori, New Hampshire Institute of Politics. The first question you kind of have to ask about when writing about Robert Kennedy is why another book about Robert Kennedy? There are a lot of books. And one thing I wanted to understand was Robert Kennedy at the end of his life, considered a political hero by many. And I think what I wanted to explain was how he became that, how he got that way, and how do we get these political heroes, what are their developments. So I tried to approach it from sort of a contemporary standpoint in writing these pieces as you went, as they occurred in real time, month by month, sort of. And so to do that, I had to focus on a small period of his life. And this is the one I focused on. But for those who need a little bit of a grounding in Robert Kennedy again, here he is, born November 20th, 1925 in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the 7th of 9. He was born 8 years after his brother Jack, 7 years before his brother Teddy. So as his mother would say, in later years, he had 2 much older brothers, 1 much younger. So and none of whom were good playmates for him. So he was a kid who was alone a lot of his life, a lot of his early life. He later talked about attending many different schools, more than he could remember. He lived his life in a lot of different places: Hyannisport, Bronxville, Palm Springs, London. And he was sort of an outsider. He was awkward. And I think in later years you see this Robert Kennedy many times as someone who understood what it was like to be apart from the rest. And he also valued and idealized his family. This is Jack Kennedy in 1941, and Bobby's just off to the side holding a shoe. He's wearing sun tape on his nose. This is 2 years before JFK becomes a war hero in PT 109. Bobby's oldest brother, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., was killed in the war. Jack was badly injured. His other brother-in-law was killed. Bobby did not have a chance to serve. in action. He did serve in the Navy. And he went on to go to Harvard, though, and lettered in football, unlike his brothers. He dabbled in journalism. He went off to the University of Virginia for law school. And he married Ethel in 1950. He was the first Kennedy man to settle down. He was the first of his generation to have kids. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr., you see there, he would like to say of Bobby that he was the one who would keep the Kennedys together. Family really defined Robert Kennedy, and for most of his professional life. So I just said he was in law school at UVA. He did not attend his graduation because he went to Massachusetts in 1952 to help his brother run his Senate race. And he was the campaign manager in that race, and they won. And Bobby also won a reputation as a hard-driving taskmaster. He was very tough on what he saw as some lazier politicians in Massachusetts. He came away from his first campaign experience with a low opinion of people in the political trade. He got a job in the Senate alongside his brother. He was working for the Investigations Committee. He worked for Joe McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin, very controversial for his statements on communism, and McCarthyite is a thing. And so if you come away with an "ite" after your name, you did not maybe succeed in politics. But he became an investigator, and this sort of ruthless reputation started to follow him. And also he continued to do what his brother needed him to do. In 1956, he tried to help Jack secure the vice presidential nomination for the Democratic Party. They lost that bid, but Bobby joined Adlai Stevens's presidential campaign to help learn how to operate a national political organization, which was something that they thought JFK would need. The thing about the 56 convention, also to go back to explain the vice presidential situation, the Democratic nominee, Adlai Stevenson, said, I'll let the convention choose my nominee. Keep that in the back of your mind because this sort of situation is going to come up again. In 1960, Bobby went all over the country working for his brother, worked to the bone on the presidential race, yet he still attended Mass on Sundays. And that sort of showed this single-minded devotion that Bobby had, would show again and again in his life. Joseph Kennedy Sr. would say that Jack worked as hard as any mortal man can. Bobby works a little harder. And that was the atmosphere that carried him through. They succeeded. In 1960, JFK narrowly won the presidency. And Bobby didn't know what he wanted to do next. He had considered going to England or going to Harvard to study some. He did not really foresee an administration job, but his father did. And his father knew that JFK was going to need someone to be completely loyal, to give him the advice unvarnished, and to keep an eye out for his brother as well. They resisted too. They sent their transition manager, Clark Clifford, down to Palm Beach to talk to Joseph Kennedy Sr., who explained very rationally why maybe it's not a great idea to put young Bobby in this role. Joseph Kennedy replied, without malice, Bobby will be the Attorney General. And so he was. JFK joked that when he was going to announce Bobby's appointment, he was going to poke his head out of his Georgetown home, look both ways down the street to see if any reporters were there and hopefully not there, and he was going to whisper, "It's Bobby." But in reality, before they did this little press conference for the reporters stationed outside his home, he had to tell Bobby to comb his hair. So that was the Attorney General of the United States. What did Robert Kennedy do as Attorney General? He was heavily involved in foreign policy in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs crisis, later the missile crisis, and also a budding crisis in Vietnam. He also had a major role in domestic politics, in the general politics of the judiciary, and in the legal battles, also civil rights, very big, immigration as well. Bobby was divisive because of this. And there were favor seekers who would come to JFK asking for things, especially when he was in the Senate. JFK would meet with them in his office. They would ask for some sort of impossible demand. JFK would smile and he would nod and he would say, go see Bobby in the basement. Bobby would then meet these people in his office where he would tell them no. And that was the job. You had to have someone who was going to do that. But because of that, Bobby got this reputation. And the law professor Alexander Bickel put it this way: Robert was perceived as a tough guy, insensitive, cruel, vindictive, clannish, summed up in a word which he never shook off: ruthless. And that man in the far corner of that photo, Kenneth Keating, Republican senator, remember who he is, just over J. Edgar Hoover's shoulder. He's going to come back as well. So, in the fall of 1963, Robert Kennedy thought he was politically toxic for his brother facing re-election in 1964, and that perhaps he should step away, resign as Attorney General, maybe not go and be a campaign manager in 1964, because people would still think he was involved, still important, because he was saying that people were starting to make it not Robert Kennedy did this, but the Kennedy brothers did this, and that was going to be a hard thing a hurdle to clear. But JFK said no. He thought they would be running out on, it would be perceived that they would be running out on civil rights and other tough fights. And he told his brother he should stay. And so on this day, November 20th, 1963, Bobby saw his brother, agreed that he had to do what he had to do, and went back to the Justice Department for a birthday party where he appeared to his colleagues as somewhat depressed and upset about his current situation. But 2 days later, their worlds changed. Millions watched Robert Kennedy mourn, and it was his first time without direction. Oh, did my screen cut out? Sorry. We're going to need this in a little bit too because, oh good, all right, great. So millions watched Robert Kennedy mourn, and as I was saying, it was his first time in his whole entire life without direction, because from the time he graduated law school, he would basically do what his brother needed him to do. He would work for his family's interests. And now he was the top person in his family. And he cared deeply about JFK's legacy and about preserving it. And he was concerned that maybe LBJ wouldn't do so. And he was also concerned that LBJ would not take care of the people in the Kennedy orbit, the people who had served his brother so loyally. He would tell people to get what you want because in 11 months we won't matter. And by 11 months he meant the 1964 presidential election. And the power was now with their political adversary, Bobby's political adversary to be particular, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And there you see Bobby just days after the assassination in the joint address to Congress. The New York Times wrote that his slight figure was the most moving sight inside the congressional chamber. He was depressed. People looked at him and they saw desolation. But he also knew he had to do something to keep in the mix. He had to keep power. And he really thought to seek it in the most conventional way. Earlier the morning of that video, it was 2 days after JFK's funeral, a young press aide in the Justice Department named Jack Rosenthal was going to work, and he spotted Bobby on his way in. And he was kind of shocked by this because he didn't think the Attorney General would be coming into the office that week. And then he was sort of relieved because Bobby didn't see him. And Jack Rosenthal, who was 28 years old, didn't know what to say to someone who had just lost their brother, who happened to be the President of the United States. So Rosenthal goes to his desk, and all of a sudden he's called into the Attorney General's office. And he's there, his boss, Ed Guthman, who was Bobby's top press aide, was there. And they showed him the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Dead center in that day's edition was an article, "Hopeful Air Pervades Capitol as Officials Buckle Down to Jobs." It was a glowing review of Washington under LBJ and the transition of power, except for one thing. And this says, "But if some new frontiersmen were overcoming their despair, others were not. A Kennedy appointee at the Justice Department complained, 'It's pretty hard to identify with a Texas wheeler dealer.'" Bobby Kennedy wanted to know who might have said this, if Jack could figure it out. Now, Jack talked to the Wall Street Journal reporter pretty much on a daily basis, so he thought, give him a call. Now, the reporter that Jack talked to wasn't the byline in the story, and Jack thought it was a tough task to be handed, but given the situation of everything that was going on, he'd try. He calls the reporter up. The reporter says, "I'm sorry to tell you, Jack, it was you." Jack had described LBJ in the same exact language, except with an expletive. In 1963, they couldn't print an expletive in the Wall Street Journal, so they changed it to wheeler dealer. Now, so Jack went back and told him, and thought he was going to be in a lot of trouble. RFK was relieved. He said, "Oh, I thought it was this assistant attorney general." And Jack came away from that experience, Jack Rosenthal, with the question, why did he care? And he realized in later years that at that moment, just hours after burying JFK, Bobby was thinking about politics. Again, he was mourning deeply. And yet, December 5th, 1963, 2 weeks after the assassination, he asked Arthur Schlesinger, "Should I go for the vice presidency?" Now, you may be asking, how is this possible? And that's going to need a primer in presidential succession. In 1963, this was the succession. The President, John F. Kennedy, Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, Speaker of the House, McCormick. And after Dallas, this was the line of succession. And that's LBJ, McCormick, and Carl Hayden. This is all before the 25th Amendment made it possible to fill the vice presidency. There was no constitutional way of filling this role. And to make it even better, you had McCormick, who was 72 years old, and Hayden, who was 86 years old at the time, the Senate President pro tem. And the vice presidency would be vacant until the '64 election. This had happened not actually so long ago in history, when McKinley died in the first year of his second term, and when FDR died in the first year of his fourth term. The vice presidency was vacant for all of this time. An advisor to Bobby actually wrote a memo about this, named Fred Dutton, about the vice presidential line of succession and how these people had gone about getting this office. And the main point of his memo was the president's choice, typically in situations like these, do not get carried through. LBJ had the biggest say on who was going to be his vice presidential nominee. There's no question about that. But at the end of the day, it was the delegates of the Democratic National Convention who were going to decide. And at that time, the delegates were the power brokers of the party. Primaries had begun, and they had even gotten some more relevance after JFK made some impressive showings and used the primaries to show his electability in the 1960 cycle. But the primaries were still sort of regional and not so binding. It was still the power brokers, but they could make a point. And so I'm going to take you inside some of my research now and show you some things. But this is a memo from an assistant attorney general named John Douglas. He was the son of a senator from Illinois. And he typed it up himself. You could sort of see it's a little messy. And in the memo, from January 6, 1964, just after the new year, he explained to him the rules of the New Hampshire primary and the qualifications. And he wrote that the preference primary is for candidates for both president and vice president. And he underlined vice president twice. Now, Douglas wrote to Bob atop this memo, think about this, John, and signed it. But, so what? It's a memo. People get memos. You write memos, you send them. Doesn't mean that their advice is taken. But RFK initialed it, which signaled to his secretary, I'd read this, I reviewed this, okay. I found this in his attorney general's papers up down in Boston. So, again, so what? Bobby's aware that there's a write-in in New Hampshire for vice president in their primary. Moving forward, January 8th, Robert Kennedy gives an interview to the New York Times in which he says that he will stay as Attorney General. There was some speculation that he would leave, that after JFK he felt he was no longer serving the president that he had gone to Washington with and might move on. The calendar from this day, from Bobby's desk diary at the Attorney General's office. If you take a closer look here, you see 11:30, Tony Lewis, that's Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, the person he'd given the interview to. You see a joint session of Congress there, 12:05. And then at 1:30, luncheon at House, Peter Crotty. And who is Peter Crotty? Peter Crotty was a power broker. One of those people who'd have a lot of sway at the Democratic National Convention. He was the boss of Buffalo, New York, Erie County, which was the 15th or 16th largest metropolitan area at the time, from the biggest Democratic delegation to the delegation to the Democratic Convention. And 2 weeks later, Erie County endorsed Robert Kennedy for vice president. Now, they were the first in the country to do so. They were 2 weeks later, not 2 weeks later, excuse me, a few days later, they had a state dinner for the Democratic Party in which Peter Crotty and some others tried to organize an endorsement by the entire New York state delegation of Robert Kennedy as vice president, which would have been huge going forward. Crotty said his whole idea was to create a national wave in support of Bobby as vice president. And in a way, he sort of succeeded. This is Governor John King of New Hampshire, 1962. John King was a Democrat, which was rare for New Hampshire in those days. He had a priority, passing a state lottery, which was unique in the country at the time. And they passed it through the State House in 1963. And that first lottery since 94, that's 1894. This is from the New York Times from 1963. But it was subject to approval, the way that the law was written. It was subject to approval by local jurisdictions. They needed to have a vote. The vote, next available vote was March 10, 1964, the New Hampshire primary. And there was a competitive Republican primary that year, and there wasn't a Democratic one. His advisors were well aware of this, as memos and other documents show. And a little closer look, because this memo is hard to read on the screen. But that's to Governor King from Bill Dunphy. William Dunphy, an advisor, informal advisor, outside advisor to Governor King. And he wrote, about how there was going to be probably well over 100,000 Republicans going to the polls on March 10th. As many as 125,000. And with present developments, there will only be anywhere from 18 to 25,000 Democrats. This is late January 1964. And he recognizes Peter Crotty's endorsement of Bobby up in Buffalo, and he says, we've had, we need to have some conversations about a well-planned effort on behalf of the Attorney General here in New Hampshire, because it could be a stimulant, bring out another 25 or 30,000 votes. So they realized RFK could help them. And if you look in RFK's phone messages just a few days later, February 4, 1964, you see Bernie Booton calls, another New Hampshire political figure, who was down working in Washington as part of the administration. Wanted to schedule a meeting with Bobby, and you see there on the side, 3 o'clock, February 10, 1964, they scheduled the meeting. While all this was going on, a man named Paul Corbin. And this is Paul Corbin in 1960. He's the guy wearing the suit with the jacket on. Not a lot of photos of Paul Corbin. I would have had a better one for you. But Paul was this is sort of typical, this scene of how Paul operated in politics. He was kind of like a carnival barker. He went into tough situations in which they would not want to send you back ever again to get the job done. Usually when there was a Democratic organization that wasn't doing so well and they didn't want to upset the local power brokers, they'd send in Paul. He'd organize the Republicans, the Independents, and get that operation going. He worked in Wisconsin. Here he is. This is Janesville. And he actually got Paul Ryan's uncle involved in getting a JFK fundraiser started there in 1959. This photo is taken. West Virginia and New York State. He couldn't get a job in the Department of Justice when JFK won because he had a long record with the FBI. He had associations with communists. So Bobby put him at the DNC. Bobby loved him. He was considered Bobby's guy. He was at that dinner with New York State officials that I mentioned earlier where they were trying to get them to endorse Bobby. And actually, Corbin being there might be a reason why they failed, because Corbin at the DNC, one of his things that he kept an eye on was New York. And he had a big flag, a big map of New York on his wall. And in each county, he had flags. Blue flags were for leaders he liked, the county leaders he liked. Red flags were for leaders he thought needed to go. And most of his flags were red. So he might not have been the person to convince them to endorse Bobby, but he was Bobby's guy at the DNC. In late January, early February 1964, Paul Corbin shows up in New Hampshire. He works with a local ad man. He buys campaign ads for Bobby, starts pushing, trying to organize vice presidential write-in push for Bobby. This does not sit well with the President of the United States. LBJ is now in control of the DNC. He doesn't like a DNC officer, the special assistant to the chairman, going to New Hampshire and working for a vice presidential candidate. He wants to seem fair. So after a meeting with Bobby in the Oval Office, he pulls him aside and says, Paul Corbin's in New Hampshire. Get him out of there or make him quit the DNC. Bobby says, I don't know what you're talking about. And they have a little back and forth. LBJ is calling people, telling them to make phone calls with recorders on so that he has proof. And then Bobby keeps denying, eventually says, you know, if you want to fire him, then you fire him. I'm not going to do your job for you. And they have a really tough battle. Bobby always played this game, though. As one of his aides, Walter Sheridan, used to say, he would say, Paul who? You know, he liked to keep a level of distance between himself and Corbin. And Corbin talks about this in his oral history interviews with the JFK Library, that Bobby would always deny knowledge of what he was doing. But he felt he did. But LBJ got his way. In February, they said that Corbin had resigned from the Democratic National Committee. And then in March, on the day of the New Hampshire primary, the story came out that Corbin was fired. And RFK remained strangely adamant over the years. Even later, he did a oral history project in May of 1964 in which he said, Paul Corbin never went to New Hampshire. This was after everyone had acknowledged that Paul Corbin had gone to New Hampshire. His brother-in-law, Steve Smith, was aware that he had gone to New Hampshire. I always find it strange. There are still Paul Corbin oral histories under seal at the Kennedy Library. So there are 2 of them left. I'm hopeful that one day that will come out, what exactly Paul Corbin was doing in New Hampshire and who knew in 1964. But consider that the days that RFK was having a conversation with LBJ and about New Hampshire, he was getting this kind of information into his office. And now you see these phone logs, but luckily sometimes they don't get him and they leave a message. And that's like a bingo for historians, because we're able to see what they were trying to say to each other. And Charlie Bartlett, who is a columnist in Washington, he called Bobby to let him know that a local delegate had filed at the last minute for an alternate space to the Democratic National Convention. Charlie says there was no publicity on it. It's an awful lot of information for someone who doesn't know what's going on in New Hampshire. And that's one of the things that makes me question how much Bobby knew. Because then a few days after his fight with LBJ over Paul Corbin, he's getting messages like this from Bernie Booton. Now, he had taken the meeting with Bernie Booton. So I'll read you the message. Bernie Booton called. He talked to Ted after seeing you, Ted Kennedy. Ted completely agreed with the conclusions that you discussed. He has been in touch with New Hampshire, and everything is in operation. There's no problem. He thinks they will be able to take care of everything. What were they taking care of? Well, Governor King soon after endorsed Bobby for the vice presidency. The entire state committee endorsed Bobby for the vice presidency in the New Hampshire primary in 1964. The state party encouraged their local representatives to turn out the vote for Bobby, and they supported him, and they paid for advertisements. And they capitalized on this sentiment for JFK. They were trying to really pass their lottery sweepstakes. And LBJ got some support from them too. You saw in that letter that they were also saying, write in LBJ for president. But it was almost like LBJ became Bobby's running mate in this 1964 New Hampshire primary. In fact, the Boston Globe's political editor wrote at the time that it was likely, just days before the race, that Bobby was going to get more votes for vice president than LBJ was going to get for president. And so, understandably, LBJ was going nuts over this. And he was scouring for intelligence on Bobby and Bobby's actions. He knew where Bobby was having lunch those days. And you'll see, it's pretty evident where he was getting his information from the FBI, because I'm about to play a clip for you in which it was a long conversation with LBJ and his aide, Bill Moyers, there. It was 13 minutes long. There was a 2.5-minute redaction. It's from the night before the New Hampshire primary in 1964. And I filed a deed request on it, and they cleared it, and they released it to me. And so not a lot of people have heard this. Probably, this is the most people who've ever heard it. And Moyers had just read LBJ an article about the New Hampshire primary. And I'll play you their reaction, which they recorded and which they redacted for the last 40 years.
It's really a campaign. Well, he was sweet, but I think we would just write it out, just take a little time, and he'd make a nice himself, is what I wish he could. I do think that once we do have an organization that is law, like we would not use the state. I don't see how he respects it in the justice department and doing stuff like this. I think at a matter of time, probably after the convention, he's bound to have to run on trial. The president was trained by Jesuit, and that was have a political philosophy, you know. And that's it. You're not in support of your opinion. The meeting stuff about it. Like mighty quiet, like is your business, quiet is important. Well, we could ask him to resign tomorrow. That wouldn't be good. I don't know, he'd be pretty lonesome, but I'd take all his people around and not have that power. I didn't think I thought that you very about it.
So to sum up, because the governor of New Hampshire won the lottery, the President of the United States almost fired the Attorney General. And what happened next? That was the night before the New Hampshire primary. This is what happened. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. won the Republican primary in a write-in vote all the way from Saigon. He was the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam at the time. And the Kennedy story kind of got bumped from being the top thing to, you see down there, Kennedy trails Johnson in write-in vote. Bobby trailed LBJ by about 4,000 votes. In the end, it was a presidential write-in and there was a vice presidential write-in. But if you look at the others, Hubert Humphrey, Sergeant Shriver, Adlai Stevenson, Ed Muskie, and Teddy Kennedy, you'll see that Bobby really blew the others away. And that kind of is in line with how the public polling was at the time. The rank and file Democrats wanted Bobby as the vice presidential nominee. And Bobby did more in this presidential, vice presidential search quest that he had. One of the most interesting things I found was these receipts for speech lessons. In January of 1964, he started taking public speaking lessons. And he would fly up to New York, where he had a speech teacher. Her mother had taught Eleanor Roosevelt, and he would sometimes do it with other business, sometimes not. And like the day before this speech, this was Scranton, his St. Patrick's Day speech, his first major political speech after his brother's assassination. There's more of Bobby's traveling around the country as a strategically traveling, I should say, because one aide wrote out a memo of go here this weekend, go there this weekend, and again, so what, people write memos, but it matters when people follow the advice. And Bobby followed the advice almost perfectly. And Lyndon Johnson had lots to fear of Bobby's political power because at the convention, it could be susceptible to these sorts of movements, these demonstrations on the floor that could just sweep away what he wanted for his choice. And so here was the Democratic National Convention in 1964. You see the stage, the political editor of the Boston Globe said, well, there's the Democratic ticket, Johnson and Johnson. They held the balloting. Hubert Humphrey was the pick for vice president, and they held the balloting in which the delegates vote, all before this. This is Robert Kennedy introducing the memorial film to JFK. They pushed it back in the week because LBJ knew it was going to happen. Mary McGrory, a columnist, wrote a story about this. And the morning he's saying that they're pushing it back to Thursday because they're worried about the balloting, demonstration for RFK and JFK. And there's a tape of LBJ talking to one of his aides saying, Mary McGrory got our story, who do you reckon leaked it? So that's how we know that. But LBJ's instincts were absolutely correct because it was a mob scene. There was as many know, an ovation for over 12 minutes of Bobby. And a lot has been said about that speech, about what he said that night. But I think the fact that he had that long ovation where people were just stamping and cheering and clapping for him all night long is the most important thing. This is a photo, with Bobby's eyes rimmed red, taken by a photographer named Steve Shapiro. He's the guy who took the photo that's on the cover of my book. It's on the Kennedy campaign poster that you see out in the hallway. Steve took that photo as well. I asked Steve about the convention. He was there, and he said he took this photo and developed it and saw that he was crying, and he put it in a drawer. And after Bobby died, they published a special edition of Look magazine, in which they used this photo. But to talk about Robert Kennedy's progression more beyond this vice presidential episode, I'll go to another magazine cover. It's Life magazine. You see the future ambassador to Japan sitting on his lap there, Caroline Kennedy. Bobby was the patriarch of the Kennedy family after this. He would say that the first four of his family were gone. Joseph Kennedy had died, Jack had died, their sister Rosemary was rendered mute by a botched operation, and Kit Kennedy had died as well. And he understood his place in the family and how that factored into his decisions and how much change they could handle. And so June of 1964, take a step back, Robert Kennedy had been considered a candidate for the New York U.S. Senate nominee, the Democratic nominee that year. There was a Republican senator in New York, and Bobby was under consideration. Then Ted Kennedy was in a plane crash. The pilot was killed instantly. One of Teddy's aides was mortally wounded. Teddy was pulled from the wreckage. Bobby was in Hyannis. State trooper came to the door, said, Teddy's been in an accident. We don't know how serious it is. Come with us. So they went, and Teddy was in very severe shape, and they were going to have to keep him in a frame for many months. And so you see that photo of Robert Kennedy there. And here he is, Northampton, Massachusetts, wandering the ground, saying somebody up there doesn't like me. And decides his brother-in-law had been running a campaign, laying the groundwork, realist about the vice presidency, saying this is not going to happen. So he is seeking out these New York power brokers. Maybe we'll run for the Senate seat. Bobby says no. A month later, Lyndon Johnson rules out Bobby. He makes all these sorts of funny calls to members of his cabinet to say, hey, just so you know, you're not going to be vice president. They're literally laughing at him. And Jack Valenti, one of his aides, says to the president that night, well, you really got rid of them all. And he said, only had to eliminate one. And that was Bobby. Bobby took a couple days to think about it and decided to go out to New York. And so a Virginia resident who became the New York Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate in a matter of weeks. It was a rough transition. Here's the Fulton Fish Market. Bobby was a little bit of an awkward candidate, but he could really attract the crowds. Here he is in Coney Island in 1964, early in the campaign. You can sort of see he looks wooden in this photo, and that's true. He was an awkward guy by nature. He you talk about the Jeb Bush please clap moment. Bobby actually had one of those in this 1964 race where people didn't understand where he was landing, so he said, please clap now. People struggled to hear him, but it wasn't about hearing him, it was about seeing him. And they would tear at him. They had a strategy for keeping him in the car. You could see one aide would hold on to his belt, another aide would be wrapped around his knees to brace for this. It was grueling physically. Bobby met with his schedulers early in the campaign, and they say hello to him. They don't recognize him. He reaches out with his left hand, with his pinky, because the rest of his hands were so puffy and bruised and bleeding. And he said, this is what I wanted to talk to you about. He had been overscheduled, and he said, I can do it. I'm just not going to be able to think straight. But people needed this release in 1964. They had suffered a great tragedy in losing his brother. Many of them felt personally connected to that trauma. And so Bobby would go out there and he'd expose himself to people. He would say, it makes me feel like a Beatle. And it was really the reason he stood a chance in this race. Because this man, Ken Keating, his pink cheeks, white hair, Bobby said he looked like a grandfather. He also said that he was very grandfatherly towards him when he was when he was Attorney General and they were working together with Republicans in the Senate. He was a liberal, an authentic liberal. In 1964, he had rejected Goldwater. He had walked out of the Republican National Convention. And he was a formidable candidate in a formidable year. This is actually Keating's record. This is from a Keating flyer. He won 7 consecutive races, and this is how he cast RFK's experience. Appointed, rejected candidate for vice presidency, handpicked by the bosses. This was going right at Bobby Kennedy's ruthless image that we talked about earlier. And the idea was Bobby's not running for Senate, Bobby's running for president. He just can't run for president right now, so he's going to use you. And it was a good message. This stepping stone, which kind of became the watchword for this, it was a stumbling block for Bobby, who was, struggled to getting his message out, to rebuff these attacks, but he thrived in question and answer sessions. And he needed these interactions. It was sort of called back to his experience as a prosecutor. Ask a question, get an answer. he couldn't really go on for a speech. And so they cut ads of him taking questions like this. Why New York? You know, Keating had attacked him on civil rights, saying that he should have stayed to see the implementation of the bill. The whole thing about, is he running for president on our watch? And so there was that. And there's a lot more about the Senate I could talk about, but I want to talk about one thing that's actually not in my book, and it's this debate drama. Well, the debate drama is in this book. There's a specific moment that I didn't include in the book. Couldn't agree on debates. They each rented a half hour here and a half hour there, side by side. They were, the original intent was to mix them together and debate each other. When they couldn't agree, they each decided, we'll do a half hour, you do a half hour. Keating says, Bobby won't debate me. And he had an empty chair and a lectern that said Bobby Kennedy on it. And Bobby decided to show up 3 minutes before air and say, I'm here to debate. So at 7:28, Bobby shows up. CBS, the executives and the security say, you can't go in. You see that sign, please keep out, no visitors, Keating. I don't know if the Kennedy campaign put that sign up, but because it's so perfect to illustrate his point of Bobby outside. After this farce goes on, and they know this is going to be the front pages of all the newspapers, which it was, Keating literally is chased out of the auditorium by reporters who run down the hallway. And one reporter from Newsday named Myron Walden says he topples over a couch. You could see the couch that they'd pulled out there, and falls onto his back. And who flies over him but his younger, more athletic colleague named Robert Caro, who we now know as the Lyndon Johnson chronicler and one of the great historians of our time. Now, I asked Robert Caro about this story. Mike Waldman died 20 years ago. I asked Caro about the story. He said it wasn't true, so I didn't include it in my book. But it's a great picture, and I just love the image of Robert Caro leaping over the couch. He did have a byline on this story, though. So Robert Kennedy won. This is actually the scene from his election night in 1964, him shaking hands with LBJ. He really rode his coattails in many ways. Bobby won with 54% of the vote. LBJ won in New York State with just under 69% of the vote. So there's a huge drop-off. Bobby said, now I can go back to being ruthless. Political reporters laughed and then sort of thought maybe he's believable in that. He went to the Senate. This is his freshman class. You see Walter Mondale up there, and the leadership of the Senate at the time. Bobby was ranked 99 out of 100. And yet he was the most watched man in the Senate. He was this celebrity senator. And in doing that, he was judged kind of on a tough curve. He was back to his old form in Senate hearings, tough, prosecutorial. The Washington Post said that he treated auto executives like teenagers flunking their driver's ed course. But Senate work was not his forte. And so senators presided in the Senate much of the time. That was their job. You see these hours logged here. Teddy, 51 minutes, because Teddy was in a striker frame for the year, had been at least, and was still recovering from his back. His secretary, he writes a note to his secretary, the AMN, Angie Novello. I didn't do too well, did I? Nope. But that was Bobby. And I think this photo gives you an idea of his reputation at the time in 1965. The morning of LBJ's inauguration, Bobby Kennedy and Teddy get in the car, they drive out to Washington, they stop by Arlington National Cemetery on their way there, they pay their respects at JFK's grave. They go to the inauguration, they witness the ceremony that they had last witnessed 4 years earlier, in which their brother had taken the oath of office. I imagine it was an emotional time for the brothers. Bobby returns on his way home, passes Arlington, which the way he went to work and came to work. He stops again, and this time there was a camera there. And a photographer took a picture. It ended up in the newspaper the next day. An anonymous senior senator said, "We're a pretty hard-boiled crowd. We notice stuff like that." They were saying that Bobby was using his brother's grave as a photo op. That's how Bobby was considered. And I think that's how you have to judge some of his actions at this time, because it affected even how he treated Vietnam. And this I find so creepy that they dedicated this bust to JFK in the cabinet room, and so he was looming over their decisions, over the deliberations, while they were talking about Vietnam. In some ways, his legacy. I think the men in that room looked at that bust and saw different things in the reflection. But Robert Kennedy had long been in private conversations and memos with LBJ, urging a political solution in Vietnam, saying focus on the government. And LBJ had a very different idea. It was about the military. RFK kept pushing this idea. In 1966, the Fulbright hearings happened. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, said something interesting about elections. Bobby saw this as taking his chance to speak. And Bobby went out and gave a speech about how we should include the National Liberation Front, the political arm, the Viet Cong, in a share of the power and responsibility. He didn't think it was that big of a deal. He went to Vermont to go skiing, and he was attacked by the media, by his former colleagues in the Kennedy administration, by the Republicans, by everyone, from all sides. And one of the main takeaways was, it was a personal thing. It wasn't about policy, it was about Bobby seeing a weakness in LBJ. Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley wrote about this situation, saying that Bobby is, the forerunner of this political movement becoming in vogue. So that's Robert Kennedy up to 1966. And so I want to give you something a little bit inspiring about him as well, about what he learned in this period. And I think really what Robert Kennedy took away wasn't that he was a better Catholic or that he read Greek poetry. I think it was that he learned change. He understood change better. It was something he spoke often of in this period. Because in this period, Robert Kennedy's life was change. He had lost direction. He had direction before, lost it. He had power before, gone in an instant. Americans were about to go through a period of revolutionary change. And Robert Kennedy talked to young people in the country about how that pace was quickening. He often talked about how for centuries the speed of travel had only gone from walking to riding a horse. And now 60 years after Kitty Hawk, after In Flight, two men were orbiting the Earth above them. He gave this speech in 1965 to college students. And this speech kind of went on. And in his very presence, he was a person, a leader who looked like and sounded like the person who had led them into the decade, but who wore the hair of someone who actually seemed to learn from it. And in 1965, he gave that speech called The Revolution Now in Progress. And that speech, over time, he would give it in South America and all over in California, in Alabama, in Virginia, in New York. And it developed into something that he later talked about in South Africa, and which became really the epitaph of his life. And that's, each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. An aide said that 3 years earlier, Robert Kennedy could not have imagined himself hopping on top of a car and singing "We Shall Overcome" with students fighting apartheid. And yet, that's where he was in June of 1966. And so I'd like to close with a quote that he also gave in a magazine interview at this time about politics for the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. He was asked about his children, and he said, "If you ask me whether I would like to see one or all of my sons in politics someday, the answer is yes. I would do nothing to influence or push them into it, but I would be pleased if it happened. Politics can hurt badly, but there are lots of other ways of getting hurt in life." Thank you.